David Livingstone, now a very famous missionary. I think most of us have probably at least heard of David Livingstone. And he was an incredible character and greatly used of God. It's not that there was anything special about him, and no matter what man of God we see, it's not that there's anything particularly special about them. It's that they were greatly used by God, and it's no different with Dr. David Livingstone. And I'll try my best to condense what I've got here in the short time, but there's so many things that happened in his life and so many things that he did. It's amazing. I definitely recommend reading about him. But he was a famous British explorer and missionary during the 19th century. He was born in 1813, I believe, and his main focus, his main mission was in Africa. And he became also determined in his life to end the slave trade. That was a big part of his work. And he saw Christianity really as a great means to achieve that goal. And I don't want to say that as if Christianity was merely a means, but certainly a part of it. But he was born in a little town called Blantyre. That's 15 miles southeast of Glasgow, where I was born. And this was 1813. And he grew up as one of seven in a very poor religious home, very poor. And just to tell you how poor, they all lived in a single room in a tenement building there in Blantyre. And Livingstone, from the age of 10, worked in a cotton mill. And he worked there from 6 in the morning till 8 p.m. at night, so 14-hour shift, 6 days a week. And he didn't earn very much money for doing it, but all that money went towards helping his brothers and sisters with their education, helping pay for anything the parents needed. And a lot of his money went to missions as well. There was a great focus on missions in his church, and so a lot of his money went towards that. And then after that, he had 2 hours of school from 8 p.m. till 10 p.m. Because the factories, there was a law that they had to give their children some education, and that was the only time they could fit it in. But amazingly, David Livingstone, he was a big reader, and he was quite different from all the other people in Blantyre, it would seem, in that he really desired education. He was very interested in science and nature, and so he would always bring a book with him to his work. And just whenever he was doing his work around the cotton mill, he would leave the book open, and every so often he would read a sentence as he walked by. And so he was very, he loved learning, and that's just what he did. And I think a lot of people made fun of him for it, but that was who he was. And so he had a bit of he found himself struggling between science and God. His father was someone who sort of believed that, science, and this was held by a lot of people at the time, that science and God don't really go together, and we should just be, happy with what God has given us and not worry about how these things work. But David Livingstone didn't agree, and the pastor at the time of their church gave him a book, and I did write down the name of the book, Philosophy of the Future State by Dr. Thomas Dick. And this argued that since all of nature was created by God, surely studying it would draw people closer to God. And so David Livingstone decided that this is something that he wanted to follow. There was a big mission focus, kind of like we're having this weekend in their church, and there was a letter that came in from a Chinese missionary. I don't remember the name of the missionary, but he was encouraging people to go out into the mission field. He was pleading with people that it was needed. Not only that, but there was a great need for medical support and for doctors. And so it all seemed to line up. And David prayed about this because he really cared about science. He really cared about God and spreading the gospel. And so he decided that he would be a missionary and that he would learn medicine. And so when he was 19, he heard this letter. And initially he wanted to go to China because that was where that particular missionary was calling people to. And I've got a quote here. It said, "It is my desire to show my attachment to the cause of him who died for me by devoting my life to his service." That was a statement he made when he was 20 years old. That's when he was a very committed Christian at the time, and he knew what he was planning on doing. And something you realize about David Livingstone's life is he was very determined in what he would do, and he would not change his mind. And he believed that this is what God was calling him to do, and nothing would stop him. And so he spent 3 years saving up for one term of medical school. That's how long it took, 3 years. And he loved it. He had a great time being amongst all his other students in academia, and he learned a lot. and it was a medical school, and he went back for a second term, and he couldn't afford to go back, but thankfully his older brother paid for him to go. So that was a great provision of the Lord. And after completing his coursework at the college, he was offered a job as an instructor at the college, £150 a year salary. For a young man, that was a small fortune, but it was not enough to entice Dr. Livingstone, and he said no, and instead he applied with the London Missionary Society to train to be a missionary for 7 years, I believe, and I think that's an interesting number of years, 7 years trained to be a missionary. And so he was very close to beginning his dream of exploring and spreading the gospel. He was determined. He ignored all these offers that people were giving him to do this and to do that and to write books. And he even decided he wasn't going to meet a girl, he wasn't going to get married, because he couldn't expect a woman to go with him to China. He couldn't expect that. And so he put all these things out of his way. He was determined. And so, unfortunately, this was a time when the Opium Wars broke out in China, and so no missionaries were allowed or admitted into China at the time. But this is where Reverend Robert Moffat came on the scene. You might have heard of him. He was a missionary to Southern Africa. And so suddenly he had a new mission field, and Robert Moffat really encouraged him to go. And a statement by Robert Moffat when he was speaking to Dr. Livingstone, he said, "Sometimes I see in the morning sun, the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary has ever been." And at the time, a lot of people believed that the population was all around the coast of Africa, but Robert Moffat knew there must be more people inland. And this was very exciting to Dr. Livingstone. And so Dr. Livingstone, after a lot of ordeals, and there's so much to look into, but he was assigned to Reverend Moffat's station in Kuruman. This is 500 miles north of the South African coast. And so at the age of 27, and that's my age, David was on board a ship off to Africa. He put in the work, and God had provided for him to go. And so I just think it's amazing how, just to nail it home, how determined he was. He knew what he had to do. He knew what his calling was. He knew that Christians should go into all the world and preach the gospel. And he led a very self-sacrificial life. So just to mention a few of his stories in Africa. Along the way, a major storm struck their ship on the way, and so the ship ended up slowly drifting its way towards South America and landed in Rio de Janeiro because the mast broke. And so what happened was they had to wait for repairs, but David Livingstone got straight to work spreading the faith wherever he could. And the other missionaries that were on the boat weren't really interested in that. They were saying, we're called to Africa, we're going to do this. But Dr. Livingstone just had a heart, and he was enthusiastic. And so he was preaching the gospel straight away. You'll find when you read about him that he got into a lot of arguments, Dr. David Livingstone, with his peers. Not many people got on with him, but I think that's because he was just more determined than they were. I honestly believe that, and more inspired to serve the Lord. And so finally they arrive in Kuruman, and he met these other missionaries. There was 400 people attending the church, but only 40 converts. And this mission settlement had been set up for 20 years. And the fact that there was only 40 converts really shocked David Livingstone. He thought, why is there so few? And he was asking, why don't we move further north? Why are we sat here, settling when there's so much of Africa to be explored? And they didn't really have a good answer for him. I've got a quote here. Let me just see if I can find it real quick. But David Livingstone was willing to go north. He said, "If you have men who will only come if they know there's a good road, I don't want them. I want men who will come if there's no road at all." And that's the sort of men that went along with David Livingstone in the end. They went along with him further north. They traveled to see who was there and to see who they could witness to and who they could ultimately give the gospel to. And David decided if no one else would, he would. So he spent his time exploring, moving north. He managed to build relations with several tribes as he moved north, and he would go and bring his doctor's equipment and heal their sick. And the people loved him. He was greatly loved of the Africans there. He spent 5 days first in Mabotsa. I hope I'm saying his name right. And it's very interesting because when he got there, he noticed he had in his hands these little black critters, and he didn't know what they were, and he went to itch them. But the guy that he was with said, "No, do not do that. Those are, it was African lice, what were they called? Tampon, I think is what they were called. They burrow into the skin. He said if you scratch them off, then their heads will come off in you, and you'll have to burn them out. And he said, what do I do then? He said, well, we'll have to douse them in alcohol and take a hot needle and get them out now. And that was just one of the many things he had to deal with. And he was worried about if he was going to offend the chief who had given him this hut to stay in, because he couldn't stay there. He had to put up his own tent, something on the floor to cover the ground, and he didn't want to offend the chief. But praise the Lord, they found a way around it, and he was able to show all the people his medical supplies, and they were very fascinated. And he said, if I'm going to heal these people, I'm going to need to use my own tent. And so they got that, and they went along with that. He said, the medicine works best in my tent. And there's so many things to share. Hang on, let's see. People were flocking to Kuramon after this to receive David's medicine. Malaria, of course, was a huge problem back then. No one really understood what caused malaria, how to deal with it. But that's something he was constantly battling with. There was another trip where he went north, and he went on many trips north. He had to cross the Kalahari, is that right? Kalahari Desert? Kalahari, that's the Kalahari Desert. And he was the first Christian missionary to do so. And it took them 2 weeks, and it was a very great struggle. They ended up meeting another people, the Bamang Wato people, and the local chief met David. And it's very interesting because he said, David, I need my heart changed. He said, I'm very proud and I'm very cruel to my people. I need a new heart. And just an amazing thing that David Livingstone went there, and God knew that this man was looking for a new heart, and he was able to give him the gospel. It's very interesting. The same chief, when he became a Christian, no one else really followed in the tribe, and that bothered David Livingstone. And the chief, I think it was Chief Sekoe, but he said to him, I have a way of getting people to do things. I take my whip and we beat them. He said, should we do that? And David Livingstone's like, no, there's a better way. But it's just amazing what he had to work around. It was very difficult as well, because the chief had 5 wives. And many of the Africans were like that. The more wives you had, the more status you had. And so he had to tell them, you'll have to divorce these wives, But he did. He divorced 4 of his wives. So it's an amazing story. They planned to move to a neighboring town, and the same chief said, no, do not go to that town. It's very dangerous. You will die. And David Livingstone was surprised to hear that there were other white people that had gone there, but he said there were white traders that went there and they were killed. And David Livingstone said, well, I'll have to be extra careful with him. But it wouldn't stop him. He was determined. And so he went, and he was confronted by the chief of that tribe. Everyone fled, but the chief came up to him and said, you better leave this place, because he thought that David Livingstone had come to avenge the white men who had died there, who they killed. And David Livingstone had heard that the way that they'd been killed was with poisoning water and giving them poisoned water to drink. So what he did was he took some of their water and he mixed it with some I'm not sure what it was, but made a sort of porridge, and he ate it in front of them. And then he set his stuff down and he went to sleep by them. And they realized that this man wasn't a threat and we can trust him. And so he won them over. And then he got up on top of some rocks and he started preaching to them. And he was able to give them the gospel. Now, I could go on, but there's so many amazing stories like that where it would be dangerous. He knew it would be dangerous, but he also knew that if you're going to preach the gospel to every creature, there's going to be a cost. And David Livingstone knew that, but it wasn't going to get in the way with his conviction and his desire to preach the gospel. So let me just see if I can put this together here. He would spend so much time with these people. He would listen to their legends. They would listen to his stories, and he would always make sure to get the gospel in there with whatever he was saying, whatever story he told. He would try and get the gospel message to them. At one point, he was greatly discouraged because one of the African people came up to him and said, "Why do you always bore us with your Christian stories? We're not interested." But so there were ups and downs, of course. Later on, David ended up getting married to Mary Moffat, Robert Moffat's daughter. And he was worried that she wouldn't, want to leave Kuramon. It was a very settled, very lush African missionary settlement. But she was like, "Absolutely, we'll go." And so she went with him, and so that was a great blessing. I think they ended up having 6 children, And it was a struggle for him because he wasn't always sure whether to leave his children or to take his children, whether they should go back to Scotland. And it was a great difficulty. It's hard to know what to do in these situations when you feel the Lord calling you to do things. And so he might not have always got that right, but he nevertheless he managed to make things work. And so there was, I'll just say one more little story and then I'll wrap it up. But there was a time where he had settled even further north. He made many new missionary settlements. He didn't get many converts, but he made a path for other missionaries to come that, the missionaries wouldn't have been able to go had he not done this, had he not done the work of trailblazing. And there was a time where he knew that there was the Boers. It was a tribe who were very against what David Livingstone was doing. He was moving north and encroaching on what they considered their territory. And so they said, we're going to come and attack you, and we're going to take your people and enslave them. And David Livingstone heard about this. And so he rode all the way to the Boers, and he stood in front of all their military, and he said, you better stop. And he said, if you don't, I'm going to write back to the people in Europe, and they're going to find out about what you do. Because one of the tactics of the Boers, in order to take over other tribes, was to take their slaves and put them in front of their warriors and run them with the slaves in front so that they'd get killed first and they'd be able to kill from behind and shoot from behind. And so they didn't want anyone knowing. They were ashamed of these tactics, and they didn't want anyone knowing about it. And so David Livingstone was able to convince them not to attack, and he ended up moving the tribes to the other side of the Kalahari Desert to safety. And so everywhere he went, he was sharing the gospel always. He even was able to meet with slave traders, and although he had a great dislike for them, as anyone would, he saw what they did with their slaves, but he still shared the gospel with them. He was still able to make friends with them, and I think that's a great testimony. And so at the end of his life, after many years, at the age of 60, he was sick with dysentery and malaria. He had traversed 40,000 miles of the African wilderness, and right before he died, I think he knew he was going to die, but he got on his knees to pray. And when the locals found him, he was still on his knees in that position, and he passed away in that position. So it's just an amazing story of a great missionary. And just one quote to finish. I got so many quotes here that were so good, but let me just pick one. He said, "If a commission by an earthly king is considered an honor, how can a commission by a heavenly king be considered a sacrifice?" David Livingstone lived a very self-sacrificial life for the Lord. He just didn't care. He never complained. Everyone around him was complaining. If you read these stories, they were sick, they had all these things, and they thought, that malaria wasn't that bad based on the way David Livingstone wrote about it. But when they got it, they just couldn't handle it. But David Livingstone, he just went for it, and he just gave his life to get the gospel out to the people of Africa, and he considered it an honor to do so. So I hope that's been a blessing to you. I definitely recommend reading more about David Livingstone.